Okay, so a little bit about me. So I've worked in apprenticeships and vocational education since 2006 in a variety of roles, including quality assurance, product development, assessment development. And currently I head up DSW's apprenticeship service, which is essentially endpoint assessment. So overseeing the design and the delivery and the quality of our EPA offer, but also actually working very closely with employers and training providers and apprentices to improve the EPA experience. So sit on a number of trailblazer groups, and I think it's fair to say that our approach is a very collaborative one. So when we're designing assessment instruments, we do like to work with the people that are going to use them rather than kind of designing them and saying, here you go, you've got to use this and there's no flexibility in it. So I think it's really important actually that there's a partnership between the training provider, the endpoint assessment organisation and the employer, because we each have a really important role to play. And actually if we're communicating early on, in our experience, that's when it's most effective and that's when it's the best experience for the apprentice and everybody involved.
My name is Laura Hopwood. I work for BPP for our apprenticeship school and I'm head of programme design. I've got experience of delivering competency workshops all over the world, so some strange places like Azerbaijan, Cameroon, various different countries. And I've designed and delivered assessor and verifier training in the past, and I've got over 12 years of experience in the exciting world of portfolio building.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, so a little bit of an overview of what we're going to cover. It's worth noting as well, we are recording this session, so feel free to kind of share it with any colleagues or clients that you work with. So as I mentioned, I'll give you a brief introduction to DSW, but then we're really going to delve right into the detail of what are the common pitfalls. We're going to look at good practice in terms of EPA portfolio building. We'll look at some of the types of evidence that we see and that we'd encourage you to put into a portfolio. Then we have an interactive activity which Laura's going to run. And then at the end we'll do a summary and a Q&A. Okay, so DSW, we were formed 20 years ago, 1999, and we worked primarily at that time in the financial services space. So as a kind of L&D consultancy firm, working mainly with kind of FTSE 100, big name, household name banks and financial institutions in the City of London and beyond. When the apprenticeship levy came in and when the frameworks became replaced by standards and endpoint assessment, actually a lot of the clients that we were working with came to us and they said, okay, well, we're slightly changing the way that we deliver L&D to respond to this new kind of levy that's coming in. Would you be interested in setting up as an endpoint assessment organisation? Because actually we work with these guys for a long time. They like us, they like the associates that we employ, and they like the way that we work. So we responded to that by setting up. We've been on a real journey of growth in recent years, and currently we are approved to offer 30 standards. So a lot of them are in financial services still, but actually we offer quite a lot of the pan sector standards as well, such as team leader, operations manager, project management, junior management consultant, business administration. So a little bit about the way that we work and where we get our kind of assessors from, if you like. So we actually have a pool of around about 850 associates that we work with. And they are people that we've worked with for a long time, some of them for 20 years. And they've all been kind of vetted and quality assured by us, and they all work with our clients, both training providers and employers, and have done for quite a while. So I think it puts us in a quite unique and strong position in that when we seek to deliver a new standard, we don't need to necessarily go on a big recruitment drive because we've got 850 people that we already work with, that we've already vetted and who we know do a good job. And of those 850, 250, around about 250 at the moment are actually qualified assessors, and they're occupationally competent across all of those 30 standards. So we've got a huge pool of resource, and we're geared up and ready to go, and actually loving what we're doing so far and loving the great work and great examples of delivery that we've seen in the last kind of 12 months to 2 years with the introduction of the standards. So currently working with about 50 training providers, and of those there are 500 employers that we work with at any given time. Okay, so we thought it would be really useful actually, and feel free, Laura, to pitch in as we go through, because my voice gets a bit boring after a while. We see quite a lot of kind of pitfalls and common mistakes. So I think don't really want to start on a negative as such, but I think it's really useful if we highlight these so that you can be aware of them and know to avoid them and how to avoid them. So we'll just kind of run through those in sequence. So one of the key things actually, and what can be the most kind of heartbreaking thing for the apprentice and even for the assessor who's assessing them and for the employer, is if you've got that really, really good employee, that really good apprentice who everybody thinks does a really good job, and they fail their EPA and everybody's kind of at a loss as to how on earth did this person fail? They're really good, they're the best in the team, they're a star of the future. And quite often it's because they might have produced a portfolio of evidence which has got some really good work in it and some really good reflective statements, and it's very articulate and well presented and professional. But actually it hasn't been mapped at all, or it's only been partly mapped to the standard. So it doesn't meet the knowledge, the skills and the behaviour statement. So as an assessment organisation, we can't, even if we're confident that that person's a really good employee and actually competent, we have to assess them against that standard. We have to assess them against the knowledge, skills, behaviour. So I think there is kind of an art in there in terms of assessment and understanding, okay, it's not enough to just be good at your job. You've got to actually be building a portfolio of evidence and presenting through things like professional discussions and interviews your knowledge and application of those knowledge, skills and behaviours in the standard. Do you have anything like that?
Yeah, I think as well we see this previously, particularly in apprenticeships where, like Jake is saying, particularly the knowledge, for our point of view, it's trying to get the learners to understand that it's not just about knowing something, but actually how they apply that knowledge in the workplace and how they understand it. And I think one of the positive changes from frameworks to standards is it's definitely quality over quantity. And when we start to look at some examples that we've got today, we can demonstrate that a bit more clearly. I don't know if anyone who's on this session, if you've got the same experience, but I think something that comes up quite a lot from a learner's perspective is how long should a portfolio be, or how long should a reflective statement be. But it's actually about demonstrating those learning outcomes. And the example I always give is, I might know the offside rule at football, but if you put me on a pitch, can I demonstrate it? Absolutely not. And it's getting across to learners when they're building portfolios that your assessor needs to see that they not only know something, but they can understand it and put it into practice. So again, feel free to use the chat box if anyone's got anything similar that they hear in the organisations that you're working in. Please share with us in today's session. But it's certainly a pitfall that we come across quite a lot.
Yeah, it's a really good point about putting it into practice, and I think that's a good measure for gateway as well.
Yeah.
It's not simply enough of actually have they tick the knowledge, skills and behaviours. Are you confident that that person is competent in the role and that they're practicing what they preach? And can they sit down in front of an assessor and kind of describe that? So the next common pitfall is no product evidence. So we're going to have a look at what product evidence is in a moment, but really essentially it's anything that the learner's produced as part of their working role. So I guess the reason we put this one in is quite often we might get a portfolio which has got really well written reflective statements and witness testimonies from peers and line managers and observations from the skills coach, but there isn't actually anything in there that the apprentice has done. So we can't rely, as an assessment organisation carrying out an independent assessment, we can't rely on the kind of testimony of either the apprentice or the coach or their employer. Absolutely, we'll include that as part of a kind of wider portfolio, but we can't solely rely on that because we need to assure ourselves that the apprentice can do and has done what they and others have described. A lot of our clients, as I mentioned, are in financial services, so it's fair to say that access to evidence can sometimes be quite difficult and a lot of evidence will be redacted. But wherever possible, we do encourage the use of product evidence and any corroboration of what the apprentice has written or what someone else has written about the apprentice actually happened. Physical evidence to show that is kind of, it's solid gold evidence that's indisputable, so include it wherever you can. One of the really common ones, and it's, to be honest, it's probably the most difficult one to answer because there isn't one answer, is around the amount of evidence to put in. And so what often still happens is you'll get a portfolio which just simply doesn't have enough evidence in, or you'll get a portfolio which in many ways is even worse, which has got absolutely everything that the apprentice did on programme, every piece of learning that they did, evidence from any qualifications that they did. And the risk of doing that is twofold. Well, first of all, it's virtually impossible to assess within a reasonable time frame, so the chances are it might get pushed back. But secondly, it does a disservice to the apprentice because actually it's burying all the really good bits of work that they did. What we want in a portfolio for EPA is a real showcase of the best bits of evidence, like Laura said. We don't want to see absolutely everything that they did because you lose the best bits of evidence, and actually it's not really very fair on the apprentice. So we do often get asked the question, well, how many bits of evidence should I put in a portfolio? And I'm always very, very reluctant to give a figure because it really does depend on a number of factors. It depends on how many learning outcomes there are being assessed by the portfolio. It depends on the quality and the type of evidence that's included. The really important thing, as long as you do this, you can't go wrong really, is to just ensure that the evidence that you've got covers each of the learning outcomes in full. And it might be that for a learning outcome, you've got one piece of evidence that covers it in full, and that's great. But if you're looking at a learning outcome and you're looking at a bit of evidence or two bits of evidence that are mapped to it, and you're not totally confident that it meets the learning outcome in full, the chances are it probably doesn't. So in those instances, we would recommend using 2 or maybe 3 bits of evidence to cover that outcome. The next one is the evidence not being attributable to the apprentice, and by that we mean the individual apprentice. It's their work, something that they did. Because what we often see, particularly where you've got things like group work and project work, is you'll have a really good portfolio, but the apprentice has talked about, we did this and the group did this. The evidence that they put in their portfolio needs to show what they've done and what their contribution was, and where possible, kind of a bit of self-reflection on how they approached the work, why did they do it that way, who did they work with, what might they do differently next time. But it's really important that every piece of evidence that is included talks about what they did and how it meets the learning outcome in terms of the apprentice's own work and own experience, not what they did as part of a group. And the next one is around, this is a really important point, do not please make the assumption that because you're delivering one standard that the approach will be the same for another, particularly with a lot of the plans that are around now that have been around for 2 or 3 or 4 years. They are substantially different in terms of the way that you're required to approach the portfolio. So for example, some will say that you can gather evidence throughout the whole duration of the on-programme phase. Some will say that you can't gather any evidence until they've gone through Gateway. Some will say that you can use on-programme evidence, but not if it's been assessed. So there isn't one rule that applies to every standard, particularly with the older standards. So what I would say is read the assessment plan, but more importantly, speak to your endpoint assessment organisation and get clarification from them as to what the requirements are for gathering evidence for the portfolio for that particular standard. And do that early on, because actually if you wait until Gateway and then you establish that you should have been collecting evidence from day one, obviously it's too late at that point. So it's really important that you know the rules in that particular standard around gathering of evidence and currency and timescales, and establish that as early on and confirm it in writing with your EPO. Feel free to pitch in with anything, Laura, because I'm conscious that I'm just bleeding on.
No, not at all. I think everything you've said is very relevant. And again, I don't know if anyone's had. Can anyone relate to these experiences that Jake has went over? Does this sound familiar to a lot of people? I appreciate it might be quite new, but can anyone relate to those examples? Is that something you hear quite a lot? Just to get everyone's thoughts. I can see quite a few people are typing. That's great. Yeah. Yes, especially evidence not addressing knowledge, skills and behaviours. And I think that's quite interesting because I think unless you're a qualified assessor, it's very difficult to, we almost assume that everyone knows how to assess, and what people need to be mindful of is that they're being assessed against a standard. So they might do something one way in the place of work, and that's not wrong at all, but what they need to remember is that they're being assessed against a standard, and the person who's making that decision doesn't sit with them every day. They're not observing them, what they're doing, and it's also making sure that learners are not doing themselves a disservice. So again, I don't know if anyone can relate to this, but we often hear learners to do an amazing job, but actually they're not very good at talking about themselves. And that's where those productive work, what we're going to talk about, so corroborating evidence really comes into place. And any witness testimonies that can be done by line managers as well is really helpful. Lisa, you've said the too little, too much evidence scenario, absolutely. And Jake is going to talk about holistic assessment, which is something that we've seen a big change going from frameworks to standards. So it's not about having a single piece of evidence for each learning outcome, but actually how much can you cover with a single piece of evidence. Yeah, Bettina, same thing. So quantity over quality and relevance, absolutely. Sandra, you've said waiting for an employer to decide who the EPS can cause problems, as you can be halfway through the standard before you're aware of what the EPA requires.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, and like I said, I mean, that's why we want to engage early on as an EPA, or we'll run a kind of session with the employer and the training provider. But you're quite right, actually, if the decision isn't made until later on, it can cause problems. I think there are some changes that we're seeing in terms of apprenticeships policy that will encourage or actually mandate employers to sign up to an EPA earlier on in the process, and we would very much welcome that. It solves a lot of the issues that we know that EPAs have at the moment.
Excellent. I can just see Peter's typing, so I'll just give him a couple of minutes to. This is where we need some music, so you don't need to listen to our voices. Yeah, that's interesting as well, Peter. So you've said it can be very vague for assessment plans, and I think at worst, and I think that is a good point. I know from ourselves working with DSW, they've been providing data support and explaining how they've interpreted the standard, but also at the same time listening to providers and how they're interpreting the standards. So I think there's positives of it being quite vague. It can be slightly flexible, but I know what you mean. There is a need there for standardisation, and I know, speaking on behalf of BPP, we do lean towards DSW for that quite a lot as well, to make sure we're simulating what endpoint assessment is going to look like at the on-programme stage. So yeah, I completely understand where you're coming from there. Gavin's just typing as well. Oh yeah, the toolkit's a great resource.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. Yeah, so I mean, if you're not aware, we do provide a toolkit whenever you register an apprentice with DSW, and in the toolkit we have a lot of kind of general advice around things like portfolios and using witness testimonies and observations, a lot of free resources that you can use, access to all of the practice and mock assessment materials, but also the key document, I guess, is the referencing table, where you can go through and record what evidence you've got against the learning outcome, and it just makes it really, really clear what you're being assessed against, what pass looks like, what a distinction looks like. And we would very much recommend sharing that resource with the apprentice as early as possible, because if they have that ownership and that sight of it, then they can be thinking about the work that they're doing and thinking about how it meets those learning outcomes. And actually, if you've got apprentices that are aspiring to do well and particularly get a distinction, it gives them that real ownership over that process. Okay, so sorry, I think we had... Yeah, that's enough for the pitfalls. So we've got some good practice now. And really one of the key points that I would try and get around is, I think there's a real perception that building a portfolio is a really onerous process, and it really doesn't need to be, because similarly with the 20% off the job training, if you've planned it in advance and if you've made sure that everybody involved is aware of the requirements and has that real oversight and ownership over it, a lot of it happens anyway, and it's just a case of recognising it and capturing it. So like I said before, if you give the apprentice that ownership early on, and you let them see what the learning outcome's like, and you let them know what the grading descriptors look like, then you're only with them really for a small part of their working day, for a small part of their week or their month. If they know what it is they're going to be assessed against, and they know that they're responsible for gathering that evidence, every day they'll be collecting pieces of evidence that will contribute towards that portfolio. And even if it's a portfolio, say, that they have to build at the end, it's really good practice for them while they're on programme to be actually going through that process of gathering it and looking at it in terms of, does it meet the learning outcome? Because when they do come to do it for real, they're going to be up to speed with it, and they're going to be able to do it very fluidly. Yes, in reality, I would say that where there's a portfolio and an assessment, there is going to be some element of actually, trying to find bits of evidence to meet the learning outcomes, but that should be very, very minimal. In reality, what you should be doing is using the work that the apprentice is producing on a day-to-day basis and then mapping that in.
I I think CK just asked the question about, is it mandatory to evidence all learning outcomes?
Yeah, and again, it's a really good question, and I would say the same point that I made before, which is it actually is different for each of the assessment plans. So for each standard that you're assessing, get in touch with your EPAO and get them to clarify whether or not you need to meet all of the learning outcomes, because some assessment plans will specify particular learning outcomes that would be met in the portfolio. Some of them actually have to hit all of them. Some of them are vague, so it's down to the interpretation of the endpoint assessment organisation. So do speak to your EPAO for each one.
Andy's asked a good question about how do you evidence knowledge in a portfolio also.
Okay, so I think a portfolio is a really good method in that it can assess knowledge, skills and behaviours. And knowledge can be assessed in a variety of ways. So you could do a professional discussion, which you could record on audio or video. You can do question and answer sessions with the apprentice. You can include any kind of written assignments that they've done. What I would advise against is, particularly if there's an on-programme qualification and the learner's kind of written some assignments or done some work, I would avoid just kind of lifting and shifting that into the EPA, because the ethos of endpoint assessment is that actually they're supposed to be doing something at the end. So by all means, if they've written assignments and have done work as part of an on-programme qualification, use some of that evidence, but don't just kind of encourage an apprentice to think, oh, well, you've already done it, so just throw that in the portfolio. So as I said before, begin early, but be mindful of the currency of the evidence. So even if it's quite a flexible plan and it says, okay, you can start gathering evidence from the start of the apprenticeship, a couple of things. The first is that the expectation is, and often the reality is that the best pieces of work the apprentice produces will be towards the end of the programme, because that's when they've been taught the knowledge, the skills and the behaviours, and that's when they've had time to apply it and practice it and master it. So most of it will come towards the end anyway. But if you do have some stuff, particularly if it's things that don't occur very often or might occur once a year, so if you've got stuff from earlier on in the programme, just be mindful of actually, does it still hold currency and can the apprentice still talk about it? So reflective statements, which I'll talk about in a moment, are really useful in terms of that. So what we'd advise is, if you've got evidence that you've been gathering on programme, is that you have some sort of refresher activity with the apprentice as they go into EPA, because if they go into an interview scenario or if they're in a professional discussion with an independent assessor and the assessor says, okay, I saw this in your portfolio, tell me about that, and it's something they did 2 years ago, they're not going to really remember and they're not going to be able to answer very effectively. So just be aware that if you're going to use all the pieces of evidence, you need to justify why they're in there, and the apprentice needs to be confident that they can talk about it in a kind of convincing way.
I think as well, just to add to that, is another change I think over the years with the way we assess competence. So just because you do something like, say, a year ago doesn't mean you've still got those skills to do it now. So I'm sure we've all got certificates, we've attended a course, we've done something before, we've passed it, but actually if we were to put it into practice now, we probably wouldn't be able to do it. So the whole point of assessment is that it's current, that learner has got that knowledge, understanding, can perform the skill, and has the right attitude as well, and knows the consequences at this moment in time and not maybe a year ago or 2 years ago. So the assessment is looking at, can you perform as you should now at this moment in time. And then Bettina and Sandra have asked a couple of questions about, do we have a mapping example that we can give as best practice? So yeah, we've got an example we can send out, Bettina, after this session that demonstrates how to map evidence. And Sandra's asked, how do we make reference to any work products that have sensitive information?
Yeah, so the work products with sensitive information is quite a common one. And so what I would say is, if you find, so where possible, redact the kind of bits that are commercially sensitive or have people's personal data in. But then if you find that once you've done that, the evidence kind of loses its context, loses its meaning, because you've had to redact so much of it, that's when we would allow or encourage the use of things like the witness testimony from the line manager to say, okay, I observed the person doing this, and actually you can kind of triple lock that by, if you get the line manager and the skills coach to both corroborate it, then that makes it a little bit more kind of compelling and convincing as a piece of evidence. So where possible, use the product evidence, but if it has to be redacted significantly, then use things like witness testimonies and observations to back up what the apprentice is saying.
I can see a few people are asking to be included in the mapping example. We'll make sure it goes out to everyone, so everyone on the session will get a copy of that.
Thanks, Laura. There's just a couple of things regarding the pitfalls as well, which I'd like to touch on actually. So one is around the use of product evidence, and Laura and I have spoken about this in the past actually, where you will get, say, apprentices who might include, for example, an internal process document from their employer, from their organisation, which they might have used that in order to kind of resolve a query or a complaint or something like that. But sometimes what they'll do is they'll just put it in without any context whatsoever. Absolutely, you can include those sorts of things in the portfolio, but they need to be kind of annotated by the apprentice to show their understanding of the policy, but also why they've included it and how they applied it in their work. It's not enough to just kind of put documents in without any kind of commentary. So what we're saying. Mapping is a really important one as well, actually, because that's another reason why sometimes a portfolio might get rejected, is if it just hasn't been mapped at all, or if there's kind of incomplete or confusing mapping. And what we don't do is we don't say, okay, this is our approach to mapping and you must map it like this, because actually each organisation, each apprentice does it differently. All that we ask is that the mapping is clear. And really, if you're doing mapping and you're doing referencing and you're sense checking it, just take a step back and think, okay, if I were an independent assessor and I didn't know this apprentice and I didn't know this employer, would I be able to pick up this document and very easily navigate it and find the bits of information? But yeah, like Laura said, we will share a kind of mapping activity that we've done.
Could I ask a question actually to everyone about mapping? Just interestingly, it's usually something that comes up in conversation quite a lot when we talk about assessment. What's your understanding of who should map evidence in a portfolio as example? And there's not really a right or wrong, but it's always a really good point of discussion. Has anyone got opinions on who should map a portfolio? So I'll let everyone type in and I'll just go through some points because it is something that comes up quite often and it is quite interesting, and I think it's something to be mindful of depending on the awarding bodies that you work with as well. So I'll just give everyone a couple of minutes to put their thoughts in. Yes, that's quite interesting. So we've got a few different examples there. So some people are saying the learners, some people are saying training providers and assessors. And obviously it will depend on who you're working with, and you need to make sure that you're familiar with your standard. Usually it should be the learner that maps evidence, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is if a learner maps evidence incorrectly, that might be an indicator that they don't actually understand that learning outcome and they don't understand why that evidence does or doesn't meet that learning outcome. And also, if the assessor does make a mistake on the mapping, that sits with the assessor rather than the learner. And we find it quite an interesting exercise actually. We ask our learners to map evidence, and it does help with their understanding of the standard, and it also avoids things that we've been talking about in the pitfalls. So you don't tend to get loads and loads of evidence that doesn't relate to the standard because they've had to go through the standard themselves and map everything. So it does give them a better understanding, and that's just in my experience, but it is something that comes up quite a lot. And Bettina, you've just asked, is the referencing table part of the toolkit? Yeah, it's all embedded in DSW's toolkit. So yeah, it's quite interesting. My personal preference is that learners map their evidence, and it's normally what EQA providers have given us, have given us advice on before. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Jay.
Yeah, absolutely. So the apprentice should own the process and have the overall responsibility for doing the mapping, but absolutely with support from the skills coach,
yeah.
And absolutely support from the employer, particularly in order from the employer's perspective to giving access to the evidence that they need to include. Another really important reason for the apprentice owning it is when they get the EPA, if, say, for example, they've had their hand held too much and their assessor's done all the mapping for them, and then they get asked a specific question about something in their portfolio, they're not going to be very well equipped to answer the question. But if they've done that mapping themselves, they'll have that real awareness of what does the outcome look like, what is it actually asking me to do, and they'll be much more effective in answering that question.
And Alex, I've noted your question around holistic mapping. We'll cover that in a second during one of the activities that we're going to do. We can touch on that.
Yep. So that brings us nicely on to the next point, actually, which is think holistically. Sorry.
Oh,
It's
sorry.
okay. Yes. So if, say, we have a portfolio that has 20 learning outcomes, doesn't mean you need 20 pieces of evidence, one for each outcome. You can have one piece of evidence which holistically covers multiple outcomes, and actually one piece of evidence can cover skills, knowledge, and behaviour. So the approach that we always kind of advise people to take is to start big. And so it's really useful for the apprentice to think about a major piece of work that they were involved in as a starting point. And that can be, for example, a project that they might have led on or been involved with, or it might be a kind of major cross-team initiative, or it could be an interaction that they had with a customer. One of our assessors gave me a really good example, and she said, actually think about the customer from hell. So when you had to deal with a customer and, you know, they might have been quite awkward or unreasonable, you had to manage their emotions as well as kind of resolve the problem. And you have to use kind of root cause analysis, you have to interact with different teams, you have to apply legislation and regulation and policy, you have to manage the whole stakeholder relationship, and then you have to get a satisfactory outcome for both the customer and yourselves. That's a really good example where if you give the apprentice the ownership over it and get them to think about it and write about it and reflect on it, and then get them to map it to those learning outcomes, what you'll find is that the penny drops and it will cover multiple knowledge statements, multiple skills, and multiple behaviours. So if you do that 2 or 3 times, you've probably got 2 or 3 pieces of evidence that cover most of the learning outcomes in some way. From that point on, you can look at, okay, which learning outcomes haven't yet been met and which ones do we think have been partially met. And you might want to apply a RAG rating to the learning outcomes or something similar to kind of get a sense as to where the learner's at in terms of completing. But that's a really useful way of approaching it, so that you're doing it holistically, you're focusing on 1 or 2 or 3 big bits of work rather than kind of piecemeal looking at each learning outcome, which isn't a good approach. So what you can then do is look at the learning outcomes that are left over, and for want of a better phrase, you can plug those gaps. And really useful techniques for plugging the gaps are things like professional discussions or Q&As. So just because there's a professional discussion, for example, in the endpoint assessment, that doesn't exclude you from also including a professional discussion as part of the portfolio. And I know you found this as well, Laura, is that quite often if you sit down with a learner and you just put a tape recorder on and you have a chat through a tape recorder, so maybe record on your iPhone, and when they're talking about it and they're reflecting on it, that live conversation often brings out a lot more, particularly from some learners, more than you would get out of just getting them to write an assignment or do a Q&A.
Absolutely, and I think a few people have touched on this as well in the chat box. So I know some people have said, do observations serve the purpose to fill evidence gaps? Absolutely, observation is one of the best types of assessment methods you can use, or evidence gathering, because obviously you can see it in real time. The key is just to make sure that the observation is recorded properly. So whether it's a video, we still need to have reference to learning outcomes, or whether it's written, it needs to be clear how it's meeting those learning outcomes. Peter, you've said a behavioural log. So yeah, a well-received piece of evidence, so how they demonstrated it. So any of these sorts of evidence types that you're mentioning would be great to fill any gaps. And like Jake says, things like professional discussions can make learners feel more at ease. It's not such as a question and answer session where they just feel like they're being tested. And yeah, Gavin, observations, absolutely, that's one of the strongest pieces of evidence that you can use. Absolutely.
I think behaviours are an interesting one as well, because they were never assessed under the frameworks, and they are actually quite subjective, really, by nature, by definition. So what's really useful for assessing behaviours or gathering evidence of behaviours is kind of peer reviews. So not just from the person's line manager, but also from kind of colleagues and peers that are at their level or within their team. And what's really useful is if you have performance review documentation. So quite often, actually, in particularly larger organisations, you might be assessed within your monthly, quarterly, annual reviews against organisational behaviours, frameworks and things like that. So actually, if you've aligned those to the behaviours in the standard, that's a really good resource and a really good base of evidence for EPA.
Absolutely, and I'll just touch on this question at the moment because it's quite an interesting one. Gavin's just said, can 20% off the job training be used as evidence? I'm not aware of any standard. I think most standards will, in the funding rules, 20% technically doesn't have to be given at endpoint assessment. However, going back to what Jake was saying earlier on, if standards allow you to build a portfolio at the on-programme stage, then absolutely 20% off the job training can be used, as long as it meets the learning outcomes. However, if you've got a standard that only allows you to build a portfolio at Gateway and endpoint assessment, technically 20% off the job training finishes at Gateway. So it really does depend on the standard, but if you're working with a standard that allows you to build it while they're on programme, then absolutely.
So a question from Lisa, observations, would we need to be careful of giving feedback, i.e. making an assessment decision? The evidence of it can't have been assessed, is that right? That's a really, really good point. And actually, so it's some of the older standards in particular, so the old guidance that came from BIS before the Institute for Apprenticeships became an entity, it did used to have that weird bit in around you can include evidence as long as it hasn't been assessed. It was never really made clear what that meant. But what I would say is, I think one of the kind of disasters that we could sleepwalk into is mistakenly thinking that because we have EPA that we don't need formative assessment anymore. There absolutely is still a role to play in terms of formative assessment, for encouraging learners and keeping them engaged, for showing how they've grown and developed against the standard and the outcomes. What I would be mindful of, though, is that if you are going to be given an apprentice feedback on their performance while they're on programme, is just that they are very clear that actually an independent person, an independent organisation is going to come in and make that final decision. So just because you said they're great for kind of 24 months doesn't guarantee that they're going to pass. Sounds obvious, but I just thought I'd cover that off. It's worth actually mentioning around portfolios that there's a real sea change in terms of brand new apprenticeship standards that are coming through. So pretty much all apprenticeship standards have a portfolio in as an assessment method, but probably around about 6 to 12 months ago, I'd say, the Institute decided that portfolios weren't an appropriate assessment method for EPA. And to be honest, I tend to agree with them on that. Because what a portfolio is it's not an assessment type, it is a portfolio of bits of evidence. So in the newer standards, what we tend to have is a portfolio-based assessment. So for example, you'll have a professional discussion which is based on a portfolio. The portfolio itself isn't assessed with the newer standards. That's just something to be aware of moving forward. But actually, even for non-assessed portfolios, everything that we talked about today still applies because it's all really good practice and it all makes sure that the portfolio is robust and that it's valid and sufficient, current, and all of those really important things that we need for reliable evidence.
Gavin's asked a question. I hope you don't mind me answering this, just as a provider that works with DSW. So Gavin, you've said it is EPAO providers not concerned about on-programme learning. I can't obviously speak for all providers, but working with DSW, that's, I would say, one of their strengths. They actually work with us quite closely on our on-programme learning to make sure that nothing's a surprise to a learner when they get to endpoint assessment. So that's been a real benefit for our learners, and we've seen the positives of DSW being involved in that side of things. Jake, I don't know if you've got any other experience with how other EPA providers work.
So I think it depends on what you mean by concern. So in terms of our remit as an endpoint assessment organisation, and what the government wants us to do, then no. So, for example, we wouldn't audit 20% off the job training, and I'd always use the driving test analogy of actually you go in for your driving test, the instructor doesn't ask you who taught you, was it your mum, was it your brother, your dog? They just care that you pass the test. So from that kind of remit point of view, then no. But are we concerned as in we want to support you and want to support the apprentice? Then absolutely. And that's not about us kind of coaching an apprentice or leading the witness or anything like that. It's really about us ensuring that we're working collaboratively with the provider and the employer to understand what the requirements are around the assessment. So it's really clear up front and there are no surprises, and everybody, especially the apprentices, is well prepared as they possibly can be. So I'm just conscious of time. I'll quickly move on to the evidence types. So we won't dwell on this, but You might want to pitch in here, Laura. So I listed just a few of the kind of common ones. Now, reflective statements, interestingly, so the newer assessment plans actually state in them that you can't include reflective statements in portfolios. However, I personally think, and I've spoken to numerous people in the sector who agree with me, that reflective statements are an extremely important tool in terms of portfolios and evidence gathering, because self-reflections are really useful and important tool for L&D anyway. It also serves the purpose that I described before of refreshing the apprentice's memory of what they did when they were on programme and what sort of evidence they put in their portfolio. But what it also does is it provides context to the evidence. So if you presented a portfolio, it might have loads of great bits of evidence in it, but actually if they're all just piecemeal over here and over there, it doesn't really tell a story. It's not really that compelling as a piece of evidence. The reflective statements, the apprentice's chance for them to really show that they know what they were doing and why they did it that way, and it really tells that compelling story for the assessor. So for older assessment plans, if you're delivering them, absolutely include the reflective statements. I very much encourage you to. If you start delivering newer apprenticeship standards in the future where it says don't include reflective statements, my advice would be do them anyway, but you don't necessarily have to put them in the end portfolio. Question and answering, professional discussions. Do you want to cover those, Laura?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I find quite interesting about evidence types is depending on what company you work for, possibly what assessor training you've done, and if that's your remit, everyone defines evidence types in different ways. So for example, I used to work for a company that used the terminology demonstration. Now obviously in the English language, demonstration means physically, doing it. But actually this definition meant someone would just stand up and kind of walk around and describe what they would do in a certain situation. So I think one of the important things to make sure that you understand in terms of assessment is, if it's an awarding body, if it's an EPAO provider, if it's your internal organisation, what are the definitions and what is your understanding of these definitions? And there's not necessarily a right or wrong, but I think it's really important that you know what your endpoint assessment provider uses, because that's what you want to get your learners familiar with at the on-programme stage as well as EPA. So reflective statements, I also know them as personal statements. Again, there's no wrong or right definition. Question and answers to me is, the difference between questions and answers and reflective statements for me is reflective statements will capture a discussion, not a discussion, it captures the reflection of that learner, so you get to see their confidence and you get to see what they actually understand about the standards. A Q&A can be in any format, so it might be recorded, it could be written. The same with a reflective statement, any of these could be written or recorded. And a professional discussion is usually with the assessor and that learner. And it's less about question after question and more making someone feel quite relaxed and having quite a rich conversation. And I know a few people on here have mentioned holistic assessment. Professional discussions are great for that. So particularly, Jake mentioned earlier on, it's quite difficult to assess behaviours because it's opinionated. But that professional discussion, particularly if you're recording it, you can see someone's confidence, you can see their communication skills, so they're usually parts of the apprenticeship standard that you're assessing. So straight away you probably start covering knowledge learning outcomes, but also some softer skills as well. And written assignments, obviously they need to be written, and observations and witness testimonies. One thing I want to point out, observations, witness testimonies and reflective statements must always include the same information, and we're about to cover that, but they're just written by different people. So for example, an observation is usually by the allocated assessor. A witness testimony is someone who works with that learner, who is a competent person, and a reflective statement is done by that learner, but it all should contain the same information. Gavin, you've said demonstrate is used in most skills learning outcomes. Do you have examples of good evidence of this? Gavin, do you mean examples of written observations? So someone's watched the learner do something and they've typed up an observation, is that what you mean? Just to make sure I've got the same understanding. Bettina, you've said that all reflective statements have to be submitted with evidence documentation. Most still have to be backed up by work product, that's correct, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a really important point that actually around demonstrate, just to jump in, and one which I wanted to raise, which is what we quite often see in portfolios is and actually in all types of evidence, is where there's a skill statement, we'll quite often see evidence that doesn't actually demonstrate the skill, where the apprentice is talking about, I would do it like this. Whereas actually if it's a skill statement and it's very clear of, for example, the apprentice can communicate effectively with superiors, for want of a better term, they can't say, oh, this is what I would do. They need to provide a solid example of when they did that, and that can be backed up by a witness statement or an observation record.
Yeah. And Gavin, you're asking what's the best way to demonstrate the learner can do the job. Well, essentially what's been recommended in the assessment plan, and that relates to the assessment principle of, has the learner provided sufficient evidence? So if the standard says they must produce a portfolio with reflective statements and a professional discussion, that is, the Trailblazers is basically deemed that's the best way to demonstrate that learner can do that particular job. Does that answer your question? So it will relate to, it'll all depend on the standard that you're assessing.